Hi, this is the PowerPoint presentation for the presentation we missed this week, where we were going to talk about teaching people and how to teach about people in history to young kids. So we're going to look real quick at how to do that. Also kind of introducing to you some people that show up in the TEKS so that if you aren't familiar now with them, hopefully you'll be a little more familiar with them later. You might need a piece of paper and something to write with if you want to take a couple of notes. But I'm also going to attach some graphic organizers for you to work on in the module that you will complete for this particular presentation. Whatever questions you might have, feel free to email me. But for now, we'll get started. This one's called Teaching People, Looking Critically at Historical Figures. Look at these images and see how many of them you can name. I'm going to be silent for a few seconds so you can think about it. All right, coming back. Hopefully some of them are familiar to you. Four of the images are significant to Texas history. So if you're going to teach fourth grade or even seventh grade, some of these names or some of the names for the images will show up in the TEKS. Two of them are not in Texas history, but in US history. I'll use my pointer on the screen to tell you who's whom. This is W.E.B. Du Bois. He was an abolitionist who wrote on behalf of slaves and African Americans. Very prolific writer, very prolific speaker, was an advocate for rights, for slave rights specifically. This little thing in the middle, which I can't find my pointer, there it is. So Spindletop, this was one of the first and most significant oil wells in Texas, Spindletop. You'll probably want to look up the date on that one because I don't remember the date. This lady is Irma Rangel. She's a Hispanic woman who lived in Texas and served in the Texas Congress, the first Hispanic woman to serve in Texas Congress. This is Teddy Roosevelt. He was one of our presidents, was also an outspoken advocate for nature and was the one who designated national parks in the United States. Oops. In the middle here at the bottom is Anne Rice. She was a female governor of Texas in the 90s before George Bush. And then over here on the bottom right is Sam Houston, who you might remember from your Journey box and your Texas history research, was part of the Texas Revolution. So who do I teach? When you get into a classroom, we've talked about this quite a bit, and if you've been in education courses so far, you know that in Texas, we have to follow the TEKS. It's a standard curriculum guide that Texas says this is what all students in Texas should know by the time they leave the grade that they're currently in. So you won't teach, unless you really want to, you won't really teach any figure that isn't on the TEKS. If you don't know someone in the TEKS, definitely do your research and find out enough that you can beforehand to be able to teach appropriately. The image on this page is an image of Cesar Chavez, who was a civil rights activist who spoke out for the rights of Hispanic migrant workers, specifically out of Southern California, and Mexicans who live in Southern California only parts of the year so that they can work in the fields picking strawberries or other farm items in Southern California. Cesar Chavez fought for their rights because these people were not being paid fairly and were not being treated fairly and were expected to live in unsanitary conditions and such. So he decided to stand up for the rights of these people. Anyway, so who do you teach? First, you need to know your TEKS and who are named in your TEKS. And then, of course, if you wish, add additional people as you wish. Make sure to understand that there's a lack of diversity and superficial approaches. So we've talked about in our SLOT analysis where there are some discrepancies in maybe there's a bigger focus on white males than on important slaves or other people who might have also contributed to a particular cause or event. So just know that maybe that's where you add in the additional people that you might teach. And then, of course, your social studies concepts or how you would teach them, using graphic organizers, using biographies, and those sorts of things help you teach about people that are significant in history. How do you teach these figures? My best advice on this is to try to humanize your historical figure as best as possible. It's kind of difficult for a kid who's 8 to understand Susan B. Anthony living in the late 1800s and early 1900s because an 8-year-old today's world is completely different. So you would want to try to make it kind of like you would talk today about Susan B. Anthony, who lived in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So first you need to know your person, and you would build a character analysis. And then you humanize them. You make sure to talk about who they were as a person, not just what they did. Look at their flaws. Tell their everyday story like they're everyday people, and just help them see that they were human beings, not just some figure that existed in the past. I'm going to give you an example of how you might do that specifically with Susan B. Anthony. You'll see her quote there. If you know much about Susan B. Anthony, you know that she was a civil rights activist, a very early civil rights activist. But I'm kind of going to try to humanize Susan B. Anthony for you and just to give you an idea of how you might do this. We can consider Susan Brownell Anthony one of the original leaders of the Me Too movement. Born to Quaker parents on February 15, 1820, Susan B. Anthony was, quote, a pioneer crusader for the women's suffrage movement in the U.S., where her doggedness and stubbornness helped pave way for the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Susan was one of those kids who blew you away the minute you met her. She was reading and writing by the time she was 3 years old. Because she was born in a Quaker family, they lived very simply. She was a very giving child. She loved being around people. As she grew on, she went to seminary in upstate New York and was a teacher until she began speaking on behalf of human rights. While she was speaking, she met more and more people on her tours of speaking, and a couple of them that made a very big impact on her, who influenced her, were Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, who were both abolitionists, who worked to free slaves and spoke and wrote about slavery as well, slave rights as well. Her BFF was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And when she met and started hanging out with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they realized that they had similar feelings about their advocacy for women's suffrage. They bonded over women's suffrage. One time in 1852, Susan planned to speak at a temperance meeting. Before her turn, she was told she was not allowed to speak because she was a woman. This only fanned her flames and prompted her to organize the Women's New York Temperance Society, where she led meetings, wrote and published important speeches, and dived deeper into her advocacy. Because of her doggedness, she was bullied and abused terribly, mostly by men and the media who didn't like that she was speaking out as a woman. Once she even went to vote before, obviously, 1920, when the right to vote was passed. Because she was not legally allowed to vote, she was arrested on site at the voting station and then was put in jail because she voted. She was, well, the judge for the case of her arrest already made his decision that she was guilty before her trial. So because she was a woman, she didn't stand a chance in that situation. That again just fueled her to keep going. She soldiered on. She kept going. She published a periodical called The Revolution. She continued to speak on behalf of women and slaves' rights. So like that young kid who learned to read at 3 and 4, she's now retiring at 80 years old after fighting and fighting and fighting and trying to make her world a more equal place. In 1906, March 13th of 1906, 6 years after she retired from her long fight for women's rights, she passed away. The results of her lifelong advocacy and fight for equal rights came to fruition in 1920 with the passing of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Just a real quick synopsis of Susan B. Anthony. If you didn't know much about her before, hopefully you know a little bit about her now, and you might have some idea of what she was like as a young kid or even a very determined woman who worked her entire life for something that we as citizens of the United States nowadays take advantage of. Or when you're teaching and when you want to teach about independent or individuals in history, there are lots of things you can do, and I'm calling them extensions in this case, but what could you do as teachers to extend the learning of your students? So if I had just given a synopsis of Susan B. Anthony to a group of students, the next thing I would do was maybe get them to create a timeline of Susan B. Anthony's life, write a script, or create a documentary about her life. Look at my notes. What is this person thinking? And kind of write down what that person might have been thinking. Create a book, create a living history museum, create posters or some kind of art. Here's one of the graphic organizers that you could possibly use with your students. This is specifically about enslaved Africans, but the students are looking at the emotions and the sensory feelings and thoughts of what enslaved Africans might have felt or heard or seen. It humanizes that situation and gets the kids more, they understand that more, becomes more real to them. And this is called an I am poem, which you're going to complete with this particular module. But it really gets in the mind of either you if you were writing this about yourself, you would write about who you are under the I am line. And then what do you wonder? What do you hear? And what do you see? And so on. Students can do this about historical figures that they're learning about in their class. That's it for this one. That's all I needed to tell you about in this one. Continue on with the module and complete your graphic organizers. Bring them to class on Monday, and we'll kind of debrief this a little bit and see what you thought. Otherwise, we're good to go. Thanks so much for listening.